I was elbow deep in changing out the brake pads on my truck when I heard the sharp, unmistakable rap of long acrylic nails against my front door. I didn't even have to turn around to know it was her Brenda Dorsey, the self-appointed queen of our HOA and a walking migraine. She'd been circling the neighborhood like a hawk ever since she got elected to the board last fall, sniffing out anything that didn't meet her warped idea of community standards. My son, Felix, had just come home for a rare visit, and I'd told him to ignore any knocks unless it was me or his mom. So when she didn't get an answer, I heard her huff, then stomp down my porch steps muttering, "Unbelievable." I figured she'd wander off like always, but no. 10 minutes later, 2 squad cars rolled up to my curb. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked up the driveway, heart thumping. One of the officers stepped out. "Are you the homeowner, sir?" "Yeah, what's going on?" Brenda was already in full meltdown mode. "He's harboring someone." I knocked, and the boy inside ignored me. "That's suspicious behavior. He might be squatting or doing something illegal." "I'm on the HOA board. I have a right to know who's in our neighborhood." I stared at her, stunned. "That boy is my son, Felix. He's 32. He's visiting for a few days." She blinked. "Well, he ignored me, so that's not how we do things in this community," she snapped, arms crossed so tight her tacky bangles clinked like wind chimes in a storm. "He should have answered. It's policy." "What policy?" I asked. She didn't answer. The cops exchanged a look. One of them muttered, "We'll just clear this up." I called into the house. "Felix, you want to come out here a sec?" The door creaked open, and Felix stepped out in gym shorts and a plain black t-shirt. Calm, collected like always. He looked at the officers and said, "Something wrong, gentlemen? We just need to confirm your identity. This woman said you were acting suspicious." Felix pulled out his wallet and handed over a badge. The air shifted. The older cop leaned in, eyes widening. "Sir." "You're with the Bureau, Assistant Deputy Director," Felix said casually. "I run national operations." Brenda's mouth dropped open. I swear I could hear her acrylics click against each other as she clenched her fists. "Ignore a knock and get the cops called, huh?" Felix said, looking at her now. "You do realize that's a misuse of emergency services, right? False report." I didn't know you didn't answer," she sputtered. "I don't answer to you," Felix said. The younger officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, do you understand the severity of what you just did?" Brenda's face flushed deep red, but she still tried to stand taller. "I'm on the HOA board. I was doing my duty to ensure your duty doesn't include calling law enforcement over a closed door," I cut in. "Maybe it's time someone took a closer look at what you and your little HOA gang are doing in this neighborhood." Brenda tried to scoff, but it came out more like a wheeze. She turned on her heel and stormed off, muttering something about respect and entitlement. Felix looked at me and shrugged. "She's got a file now." I raised a brow. "You serious?" He nodded. "You don't call the cops on a fed and walk away clean." And that's when I realized Brenda had just messed with the wrong family. 2 days after the front yard fiasco, I was out back patching a section of the fence that had taken a beating during last month's storm. The air was muggy, thunderheads gathering in the distance, but the real storm was already brewing inside the HOA clubhouse, and Brenda Dorsey was at the center of it. Felix had stayed quiet after the incident, but I could tell something was stirring behind his even tone and clipped answers. He wasn't the kind to let things go, especially when someone used authority to harass others. And Brenda's tantrum had triggered something deeper, something that made him start checking public records the same night she accused him of squatting. He didn't say much until this morning when I came into the kitchen for coffee and found him at the breakfast table with a stack of printed documents, 2 manila folders, and a look I hadn't seen since his high-profile corruption case in Phoenix. He slid one of the folders toward me. "Take a look at the second page." I did. It was a scanned copy of the HOA's annual financial report, or rather, what was supposed to be one. The balance sheet was a joke handwritten notes on a photocopied form, no signatures, no receipts, and the math didn't even check out. The total reserve fund was listed as approx. $120,000, with no breakdown of where it had come from or what it was being used for. "Is this real?" I asked. "Pulled from the county clerk's office yesterday. It's the most recent version they've submitted." Which, by the way, they're legally required to update quarterly. "And they haven't, not since last year," Felix said, tapping a stapled packet. "That's just the beginning. I've got discrepancies between what they've reported and what residents have paid. People are being overcharged and none of it's being accounted for." I leaned back in my chair. "You think Brenda's skimming? I think she's not smart enough to do it alone, but someone is. And I'm going to find out who." That afternoon, Felix went door to door not with accusations, but with questions. He asked neighbors if they knew where their HOA dues were allocated, if anyone had ever actually seen a budget, and whether meetings were open to residents. The answers ranged from confused shrugs to irritated complaints. No one had ever seen an itemized report. Meetings were announced with less than 24 hours' notice, and when residents did show up, they were told discussions were board-only due to sensitive topics. By 5 o'clock, Felix had a list of 26 homeowners willing to sign a petition to demand a full audit. He made copies, filed the originals, and dropped an envelope into the HOA's drop box marked "Urgent Board Review Required." But Brenda wasn't one to lie low. The next morning, I woke to the sound of 3 voices arguing near my mailbox. I stepped outside to see Brenda flanked by 2 board members, Dennis, the HOA treasurer, and Carla, who managed the compliance committee, which mostly meant measuring grass with a ruler and issuing warnings for excessively festive wreaths. Brenda pointed at my house. "He's stirring up chaos. And that audit request, it's harassment. He doesn't even live here." "He's my son," I said as I approached. "He owns property here through me. Legally, he has the right to petition the board." Carla looked nervous, fidgeting with a clipboard. Dennis, on the other hand, looked like he'd been sucking lemons all morning. "I want him gone," Brenda said. "He's intimidating people." "I haven't spoken to anyone who felt intimidated," Felix said, stepping out the front door behind me. "In fact, every homeowner I spoke to thanked me for bringing transparency to a process they've been locked out of." "This isn't your jurisdiction," Brenda snapped. Felix held up a folder. "Actually, misuse of community funds, failure to produce financial documents, and falsifying public records fall under state and federal statutes. So yes, it is." Dennis stepped forward. "We've done nothing illegal." "Then you won't mind showing us the books," Felix said. Brenda's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're not entitled to bully us." "No," Felix said, "but I am entitled to file a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office, and I already did." The silence that followed was thick. Carla turned to Dennis. "You said we didn't have to report anything until tax season." "I said we were behind, not hiding anything," Dennis hissed. Felix pointed at the clipboard in Carla's hand. "Mind if I see that?" She held it back. "It's private." "You're standing on public property," Felix said. "And if that has resident information being used for non-transparent enforcement, it's evidence." That's when Carla made a decision. She handed him the clipboard and stepped back. He scanned it quickly. 17 warnings issued this month for minor landscaping violations. All to residents who signed the petition. That's not a coincidence, that's retaliation. Brenda's voice cracked. "They broke rules?" "No," Felix said. "They asked questions, and you punished them. That's abuse of power." That afternoon, the sheriff's department arrived with a warrant. Turns out Felix had already forwarded his findings to the county prosecutor, who contacted the sheriff's office. An investigator named Deputy Lane showed up in plain clothes, polite but firm, and asked to see the HOA's office records. Brenda tried to shut them down, claiming board confidentiality, but Dennis panicked and unlocked the door himself. He knew what was coming. Inside, they found more than sloppy bookkeeping. There were 2 sets of ledgers, one with inflated maintenance costs and fabricated vendor payments, and another, hidden in a locked drawer, that showed the real balance. Over $80,000 was unaccounted for. Dennis cracked first, said he'd been pressured into it. That Brenda and her cousin, a contractor from out of state, had submitted fake invoices for landscaping services that were never rendered. The cousin had never even been to the neighborhood, Carla confessed next. She said she'd been told to target anyone who asked too many questions, that Brenda kept a list of problem homeowners, and they'd been quietly issuing fines to drain escrow accounts and push people toward foreclosure. Brenda refused to speak, but the investigators didn't need her to. The records were enough. By sundown, she'd been escorted out of the clubhouse in handcuffs. Felix sat on the front steps with a bottle of water, watching the patrol cars pull away. He didn't look smug. He looked tired. I sat beside him. "You didn't have to dig this deep, you know." "I did," he said. "Because if someone like her gets away with it here, she'll just do it somewhere else." "What happens next? The county will appoint a temporary committee, then there'll be a full election, fair this time. I filed to make sure it's monitored. And the money, some can be recovered, but not all." A week later, the neighborhood held a meeting in the park. No folding chairs, no podiums. Just people standing together, talking, planning, asking questions out loud. Felix didn't speak, he just listened. By the time he left that weekend, a new committee had formed, one with real oversight, real transparency, and zero tolerance for petty tyrants. Brenda's house went up for sale the next month. Word was she'd pled out to avoid jail. Community service, fines, and a 5-year ban from serving on any residential board. No one threw her a going-away party. But a few of us did leave sidewalk chalk on the clubhouse steps. We the residents, not the ruled. The neighborhood felt different in the days following Brenda's arrest. The air wasn't lighter, just quieter, like everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop. People watered their lawns in silence, eyes flicking toward the empty HOA office as they passed. No one said anything outright, but you could feel it. Suspicion had shifted from whispers to full-blown awareness. Felix had already returned to D.C. by the time the temporary oversight committee was finalized. He called regularly, mostly to check on Mom and me, but I knew he was also keeping tabs on the unfolding investigation. His tone was clipped and focused, like his attention was split between our mess and whatever federal fires he was juggling back east. Still, it was clear he didn't consider the matter closed. Neither did I. One Monday morning, I got a knock, not on the front door this time, but on the garage. I was organizing the tool wall when I heard it, a polite tap followed by a soft, "Sir?" I opened it to find Deputy Lane standing there, not in uniform this time, but with his badge clipped to his belt. He looked tired, like he'd been sifting through something heavy for days. "Got a minute?" he asked. I stepped aside, motioning him in. "Something new," he nodded. "You might want to sit for this." I didn't. I just waited. Lane glanced around before pulling a folder from his jacket. Inside were aerial photos, black and white, grainy but sharp enough to show detail. He laid them across my workbench. The first few were of our neighborhood, then the clubhouse. Then farther out, a commercial property 15 minutes away, tucked behind a shuttered nursery. "What am I looking at?" "That," he said, pointing to a warehouse behind the nursery, "was purchased 5 years ago by a shell company registered in Nevada. The listed address was fake. We traced the real trail last week." I looked at him. "And it's owned by a man named Leonard Dorsey." Brenda's brother. The name meant nothing to me at first, but Lane kept going. Leonard's a convicted felon. Wire fraud, racketeering, and tax evasion. Served 6 years in federal prison. Got out 8 years ago and hasn't had a legitimate job since. But he's been receiving monthly payments from an HOA account labeled maintenance reserves. I stared at him. "You're saying she funneled money to her brother?" "Not just that," Lane said. "We think the clubhouse was used as a front for a laundering operation. The fake invoices. They were tied to non-existent landscaping services. But we found real purchase orders for bulk goods, power tools, copper wiring, high-end construction equipment, all routed through that warehouse. And not a single item ever showed up here." I felt my stomach drop. So she used HOA funds to run a black market supply chain. Lane nodded grimly. We've got enough to move forward with federal charges: wire fraud, conspiracy, and interstate transport of stolen goods. Your son's report laid the groundwork, but this is going to blow open a lot more than just a crooked board. I didn't say anything for a while. Just stared at the photos, trying to connect the version of Brenda who yelled about mailbox paint colors to the one orchestrating a criminal operation out of a suburban HOA office. Lane finally broke the silence. We're going to need access to your security footage. The cameras facing the clubhouse, anything you've got from the last 12 months, I nodded. You'll have it by tonight. He paused at the door. And one more thing you might want to let your son know. He's probably going to get a call from the U.S. Attorney's office. That night I pulled the footage, organized it on a thumb drive, and dropped it off at the precinct. It felt surreal, handing over evidence not of petty HOA nonsense but of real, high-stakes criminal activity. The kind federal judges don't shrug off. 3 days later, Felix called. They reached out, he said. Lane said they would. He didn't sound surprised. They want me to testify in the preliminary hearing. Apparently my affidavit triggered a deeper audit that uncovered a dozen other HOAs across the state using the same vendor network. Let me guess, I said. All tied back to Leonard, exactly. I heard him exhale. This isn't just about Brenda anymore, it's a web. She wasn't the ringleader, just one of several board members being used to funnel money and cover tracks. Leonard's the central node, but there are others. They've been targeting underfunded HOAs with aging infrastructure, offering vendor solutions at cut rates, then inflating invoices and moving stolen materials. My grip tightened on the phone. How far up does it go? We don't know yet, but the Bureau's opening a task force. I rubbed my forehead. All this from a knock on the door. Felix chuckled, but it had no humor behind it. Funny how things happen. The preliminary hearing was set 2 weeks later. It wasn't televised, but word spread fast. Residents gathered outside the courthouse, murmuring as the names of other implicated board members leaked. 3 more from our county alone, one from a neighborhood 2 blocks over, another from the retirement village on the hill. All had used the same vendor accounts, all had signed off on similar payments, and all had ties, however thin, to Leonard Dorsey. Brenda appeared in court wearing a beige suit and an expression like she'd just been asked to eat gravel. Her attorney tried to distance her from Leonard, claiming she hadn't spoken to him in years. But the prosecution presented phone records, wire transfers, and copies of emails where she'd referred to him as our silent partner. Felix's testimony came via video. He walked the court through the timeline: his visit, the false police report, the petition, and the discovery of financial inconsistencies. He never raised his voice, never made it personal, but the weight of his words was undeniable. When the session ended, the judge denied bail for Leonard and ordered Brenda to remain under house arrest with an ankle monitor. The rest of the board members were summoned for questioning. Back home, the neighborhood was no longer quiet, it was buzzing. People stopped pretending. They knocked on each other's doors. They organized block meetings. They redrafted bylaws and demanded full access to financials going forward. A new treasurer was elected, a retired accountant named Lyle, who insisted on weekly transparency reports and open access audits. And then came the restitution hearings. The court ordered seizure of Leonard's assets, including the warehouse and 3 bank accounts. Some of the stolen funds were traced back through shell corporations and gradually returned to the HOA. Not all, but enough to repair the community pool, replace broken sidewalks, and remove the derelict tennis court Brenda had insisted was a historical feature. No one called it justice exactly, but it was something. On the day the ankle monitor came off, Brenda was seen loading a U-Haul with the help of a single hired mover. She didn't speak to anyone, just kept her head down as people watched from porches and driveways. I didn't go out, didn't need to. Later, I found a note on my windshield. Folded once, scrawled in heavy pen. I thought I was untouchable, you taught me otherwise. No signature, no return address, just an envelope that fluttered in the breeze for a moment before I tucked it into the trash. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, it never would be. But it was awake now, and that was enough. Felix came back the following spring. He didn't say much about the trial, just that it had wrapped, and several other HOAs were under full review. He spent most of his visit helping rebuild the community garden with some of the neighbors who'd signed the original petition. And when he left, he didn't take the security cameras down. Just in case, he said, because once you've seen what hides behind a knock, you don't stop watching the door. 2 months had passed since Brenda Dorsey left the neighborhood in silence. And for a while, the entire community existed in an odd, cautious calm. Not quite peaceful, not yet rebuilt, just watchful, like a field slowly recovering after a wildfire. The temporary oversight committee had stabilized things, and the restitution checks from the court seizures had begun trickling in. But something still felt unfinished. That something landed, quite literally, in the form of a thick, padded envelope dropped on my porch by a courier wearing government-issue boots and a badge clipped to a cargo vest. It was addressed to Felix. I called him, told him it arrived. He didn't sound surprised. "I'll be there tomorrow," he said. By the following evening, we were standing in my living room, the envelope already torn open and spread out across the coffee table. Inside were blueprints, photographs, and a series of letters typed, signed, and stamped between various HOA board members from across the state. One detail stood out immediately. The letterhead on each wasn't from the HOAs themselves. It was from a private consulting firm called Greenstone Civic Solutions. Felix narrowed his eyes. "They're not listed in the vendor registry." I leaned in. "Who are they?" He picked up one of the blueprints. "They're the ones who supplied the fake vendor profiles. Look at this." These are paper trails made to look like legitimate bids. Landscaping, pest control, roofing, all inflated, all routed through Greenstone's internal bidding network. It's a shell consultancy. Brenda and Leonard weren't working alone. He laid down a letter with a familiar name at the bottom. "Ever heard of Councilman Ray Duke?" he asked. I nodded. He was at the last town hall, gave some speech about community resilience. Felix tapped the signature. "He's the one who approved Greenstone to provide emergency infrastructure planning to HOAs after the 2008 zoning reform. That gave them legal access to dozens of neighborhoods across the state. And guess who owns 60% of Greenstone?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Felix folded the documents back into the envelope. "I have to take this to the U.S. Attorney in Richmond. It's bigger than we thought." I followed him to the driveway as he loaded the envelope into a lockbox in the trunk. The street was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel like waiting. It felt like breath being held. 3 days later, the story broke nationwide. Federal prosecutors announced an investigation into a multi-state racketeering operation involving over 40 HOA boards, a private consulting firm, and several elected officials. The case was dubbed Operation Iron Gavel. Charges ranged from wire fraud and embezzlement to criminal conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Councilman Duke was arrested in the early hours of a Wednesday morning. His estate was raided, and footage showed agents removing hard drives and several safes from his basement. Greenstone's offices were shuttered by noon. Every HOA tied to the firm was placed under emergency audit by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And then, something unexpected happened. 2 members of our own temporary committee were quietly removed by HUD investigators. Turns out they had connections to Greenstone too, not through payments, but through prior employment. They'd been plants, meant to control damage and steer the committee's findings away from deeper scrutiny. But the neighborhood was ready this time. A group of residents, mostly retirees and small business owners, held an open forum in the local library. They proposed a new framework: no more permanent board positions, mandatory term limits, and full digital access to all financials. Every resident would be able to vote on high-cost projects, and any outside contracts would require disclosure of all ownership ties. They called it the Community Integrity Charter. Felix flew back in to attend the vote. He didn't speak, didn't lead. He sat in the back row and let the community speak for itself. When the final tally was read, the vote passed unanimously. That night, he and I sat on the back porch watching the sun dip behind the cedar trees. It was the first time in months that the quiet felt earned. "You think it'll hold?" I asked. Felix nodded. "It'll hold because people are watching now, not just here, everywhere." I studied him for a moment. "You ever think about moving back?" He didn't answer right away. Just sipped his coffee and looked out at the street, where kids were riding bikes again and someone was grilling hot dogs 2 houses down. "Maybe," he said. "Once the fires are out." A week later, he was gone again, summoned to a hearing in Atlanta tied to a similar case. But this time, he left something behind. A secure drive with public access credentials uploaded to the community server containing every document, audit trail, and legal filing tied to the HOA case. He called it a citizen archive. The first file was titled, "If They Knock Again." Months passed. Brenda's trial date was set for October. She faced 7 federal charges. Leonard faced 12. Councilman Duke's legal team tried cutting a deal, but a whistleblower from Greenstone came forward with recordings, hours of them detailing meetings, payment plans, and pressure tactics to push compliant board members into place. The recordings were played live during the Senate Oversight Committee hearing. By the time the trials concluded, 28 people across 4 states were convicted. Several others were indicted or resigned under investigation. Greenstone was dissolved. Its assets were seized and redistributed to affected HOAs. Our neighborhood received a final restitution payment large enough to fund infrastructure repairs, rebuild the clubhouse, and establish a community educational grant. The new committee voted to name it after the woman who donated the seed money to start the neighborhood garden. Maggie Leland, a retired nurse who never missed a vote and never missed a chance to tell Brenda she was full of it. The grant was called the Leland Fund for Local Integrity. I still keep the original petition in my garage, thumbtacked to the wall above my workbench. Not as a trophy, more like a reminder that it only takes one person to ask a question, one knock to be ignored, and one neighbor to say, "Not here." We never saw Brenda again. Her house was bought by a young couple, a teacher and a paramedic. They painted over the beige trim, added a porch swing, and started a community book exchange out front. And sometimes, when I hear a knock at the door, I still pause for a second, just long enough to remember that day. Then I open it. Because now we don't look through peepholes. We look each other in the eye.